In the freezing darkness of December 1940, the fragile future of Western civilization hung by a thread that seemed to be fraying with every single passing hour. While the courageous Royal Air Force had secured a vital victory in the skies during the Battle of Britain, the Blitz was still raging uncontrollably through the streets. London was engulfed in flames, and the Luftwaffe relentlessly pounded the industrial heartlands of Coventry and Liverpool, turning thriving cities into landscapes of rubble and ash. On the map, the British Empire still appeared vast and imposing, with a splash of imperial pink covering a quarter of the globe and commanding immense authority. However, inside the secret war rooms of Whitehall, the men governing Britain harbored a terrifying secret they dared not whisper to a public already enduring so much. The grim reality was that the empire was not merely bleeding soldiers on the battlefield, it was bleeding to death financially at a rate that spelled imminent collapse. Winston Churchill, the indomitable figure whose voice rallied the free world, sat alone at his desk in the underground cabinet war rooms to write a crucial letter. This missive was addressed to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the President of the United States, and it would prove to be one of the most significant of his life. Churchill was a master of the English language, a man who could turn a phrase into a weapon of war, but this task required a delicate touch. In this communication, he had to perform a humiliating diplomatic dance, revealing the desperate truth to the leader of the world's richest and most powerful neutral nation. He had to confess that Great Britain, once the banker of the 19th century and the workshop of the world, was now completely and utterly destitute. The empire, that had famously defeated Napoleon and ruled the waves, could no longer afford the price of its own survival in this modern total war. The letter was long and detailed, describing the perilous strategic situation, the deadly U-boat threat in the Atlantic, and the desperate need for destroyers and aircraft. But the true sting was hidden in the tail of the message, where Churchill admitted that the British treasury was rapidly running out of liquid assets. He warned that the moment was fast approaching, when Britain would no longer be able to pay cash for the vital supplies it needed to keep fighting. Churchill wrote that while his people would fight on the beaches and landing grounds, they could not fight without ammunition they could no longer afford to buy. It was a stark plea for survival and a humiliating admission of national insolvency from the leader of what was once the wealthiest power on earth. To understand how this global titan reached such a point of destitution, we must examine the ruthless and unforgiving economics of waging a total war. When the conflict began in September 1939, Britain was still a financial giant, holding billions of dollars in gold reserves and a massive portfolio of overseas investments. British citizens owned railroads in Argentina, copper mines in Chile, and vast industrial concerns in the United States, while London remained the hub of global finance. The war that Hitler launched was fundamentally different from any conflict before it. It was a war dominated by relentless machines. This mechanized warfare consumed steel, oil, aluminum, and rubber at unprecedented rates that defied all pre-war logistical calculations. Crucially, Britain found itself in a precarious position where it had to import almost every single essential resource to continue fighting. With the European continent blockaded and hostile, Britain could no longer trade with its neighbors and was forced to look across the Atlantic. At this critical stage, the United States remained officially neutral, and its public sentiment was deeply and stubbornly isolationist. Americans remembered the slaughter of the First World War and were determined to avoid sending their sons to die in European mud again. The U.S. Congress had passed strict neutrality acts designed specifically to keep America from being dragged into another foreign entanglement. However, these acts contained a specific clause known as cash and carry, which offered a narrow lifeline to belligerent nations. This law stated that nations like Britain could purchase American supplies, but the terms were strictly transactional and immediate. They had to pay for everything in cash up front and were required to transport the dangerous goods on their own ships. There would be absolutely no loans and no credit extended. It was a strictly commercial arrangement during a global crisis. The Americans were willing to sell the weapons of war, but they demanded gold on the barrelhead before crates left the dock. For the first year of the conflict, Britain ruthlessly drained its national treasury to meet these demanding American terms. They began liquidating their gold reserves in a desperate bid to keep the supply lines open and the war effort alive. In a secret mission dubbed Operation Fish, the government loaded the nation's entire gold wealth onto battleships and fast liners. This vast treasure was shipped across the dangerous U-boat-infested Atlantic Ocean to be stored in secure vaults in Canada. It represented the largest movement of physical wealth in history, a gamble taken to satisfy the American bill collectors. Billions of dollars in gold bars and negotiable securities were sent into exile to pay for the tools of national survival. By late 1940, the gold was virtually gone, and the liquid cash reserves of the empire had been completely exhausted. The British Purchasing Commission in Washington found itself with contracts it could not sign because there were no dollars left. When Roosevelt received Churchill's desperate letter, he immediately understood the catastrophic stakes involved for the free world. He knew with certainty that if Britain fell to the Nazis, the United States would inevitably be the next target. However, the president faced a complex political problem. American laws strictly forbade giving money directly to belligerent nations. He needed to devise a method to help Britain that looked like a hard-headed business deal rather than a charity handout. Thus the concept of Lend-Lease was born, which Roosevelt explained to the press using a clever folksy analogy. He argued that if a neighbor's house is on fire, you don't haggle over the price of the garden hose. You simply lend him the hose to put out the fire, and he returns it to you when the danger passes. While it sounded generous and neighborly to the public, the reality of the negotiations behind closed doors was entirely different. It was not a conversation between friends, but a ruthless foreclosure proceeding between a bank and a bankrupt client. Henry Morgenthau Jr., the man in charge of the American Treasury, was a staunch anti-fascist, but also a guardian of the taxpayer. He believed that before the U.S. gave a single dime, Britain must prove it had stripped itself of every asset. Morgenthau demanded a full and invasive audit of the British Empire to ensure no wealth was being hidden. He required a list of every asset owned by the British government and private citizens anywhere on the globe. He wanted to know the specific value of every shell casing, every woolen sock, and every share of stock. The British negotiators, led by Sir Frederick Phillips, were stunned that they were being asked to open their books to a foreign power. They felt they were being treated not as an ally fighting a common enemy, but as a failed company in receivership. Phillips argued that selling off long-term investments during a war would be a fire sale, yielding pennies on the dollar. He warned that stripping Britain of its overseas income would leave the country destitute and unable to rebuild after the war. Morgenthau remained unmoved, standing by his instructions that the U.S. would not provide aid until the barrel was scraped. The brutal logic was that an Iowa farmer shouldn't pay for a British tank if a British lord still owned a factory in New Jersey. The most painful symbol of this forced liquidation was the case of the American Viscose Corporation, a massive industrial giant. American Viscose was the largest manufacturer of rayon and artificial silk in the United States, and a jewel in the British crown. Owned by the British company Courtaulds, it generated millions of dollars in dividends that flowed back to London to help balance trade. Morgenthau identified this company as a prime target and told the British negotiators they had to sell it immediately. He demanded the cash from the sale be deposited into the U.S. Treasury to pay for existing weapons orders. The British resisted, knowing the company was worth over $100 million, and selling now would be financial suicide. However, with the Lend-Lease bill facing attacks from isolationists in Congress, Morgenthau needed a sacrificial lamb to prove Britain's poverty. He gave the British a stark ultimatum: sell American Viscose now, or the Lend-Lease bill will die in committee. On Sunday, March 15, 1941, under immense pressure, the British government seized the corporation from its owners without permission. It was a compulsory purchase order issued under emergency war powers, a desperate act to satisfy Washington. The sale was handled by American investment bankers who knew the British were distressed sellers and drove a merciless bargain. The company was sold for roughly $54 million a theft, considering it was worth at least double that amount. The British government had to reimburse Courtaulds in pounds, adding to their own debt, while the dollars went straight to the U.S. Treasury. This sale was a turning point, the moment the British elite realized the true price of the special relationship. They were not treated as equal partners, but as a junior entity being stripped of assets to pay for survival. The United States was absorbing the accumulated wealth of the British Empire, not by conquest, but by contract. But the liquidation didn't stop at industrial assets. It extended to the geopolitical foundations of the empire itself. Britain was desperate for destroyers as German U-boats were sinking merchant ships faster than shipyards could replace them. Churchill begged Roosevelt for 50 old destroyers, World War I-era ships sitting rusting in American naval yards. Roosevelt agreed to give them to Britain, but once again there was a heavy price attached to the assistance. In exchange for 50 rusting ships, the United States demanded 99-year leases on a string of British naval and air bases. These bases stretched across the Atlantic from Newfoundland in Canada to the Bahamas, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Trinidad, and British Guiana. The scale of this trade was immense. Britain was effectively handing the United States a strategic footprint covering the entire Western Hemisphere. They gave away the keys to the Caribbean and the North Atlantic, allowing the U.S. to build bases on sovereign territory. These bases would project American power for a century, all traded for 50 old ships that were barely seaworthy. It was a geopolitical fire sale where Britain traded its long-term strategic assets for short-term tactical survival against Germany. It was the act of a desperate nation pawning the family silver just to buy enough food to survive the week. By the time the Lend-Lease Act was finally signed into law in March 1941, Britain had been stripped clean. The gold was gone, the U.S. investments were being sold off, the bases were leased, and the treasury was empty. Lend-Lease was hailed publicly as the arsenal of democracy, a noble act of solidarity, which in many ways it was. It provided the tanks, planes, oil, and food that kept Britain alive and prevented Nazi starvation tactics from succeeding. However, the financial terms laid the groundwork for a post-war world where Britain would be a debtor and America the creditor. The aid was not a gift. It was a lease with the underlying assumption that there would be a reckoning. The text of the agreement contained a small paragraph known as Article 7, written in dense diplomatic language. This clause was a poison pill for the British Empire, demanding that Britain dismantle its imperial preference system after the war. Imperial preference was the economic wall holding the empire together, a tariff system favoring trade between Britain and its colonies. It ensured that British goods were cheaper in markets like Australia and India than more efficient American competition. By signing Article 7, Britain was agreeing to tear down its own defenses and open its empire to American exporters. The British negotiators fought against it, knowing it meant the end of the empire as an economic unit, but they had no choice. With German bombers overhead and U-boats in the Atlantic, they signed the death warrant of their own trading bloc. As 1941 turned into 1942, and the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, the dynamics shifted once again. Britain and America were now fighting side by side, and the British Isles became an immense aircraft carrier for the U.S. Air Force. Yet the financial disparity only grew. American industry, fueled by government spending, exploded in size and efficiency. The U.S. economy grew by huge percentages every year, while Britain's economy was distorted and cannibalized by the war effort. Britain stopped exporting, converted every factory to war production, and abandoned its lucrative markets in Latin America and Asia. American companies immediately stepped into those vacant markets, selling refrigerators and cars, while British factories made Spitfires. The United States was effectively fighting the war while simultaneously stealing Britain's commercial future around the globe. By 1944, the transfer of wealth was absolute. The world's gold reserves had moved from London to Fort Knox. The British believed their sacrifice would be honored, and that the Americans would treat them with generosity after the victory. They assumed Lend-Lease would continue for a transition period, offering a soft landing for their shattered economy. They were wrong forgetting the lesson that in the world of high finance gratitude is not a valid currency. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered, and while London crowds celebrated the end of tyranny, Washington changed gears. 7 days after the victory celebrations began, President Truman signed the order to terminate Lend-Lease immediately. The cutoff was brutal and absolute. There was no transition period, no grace period, just a sudden halt. American Liberty ships in the middle of the Atlantic, loaded with food for Britain, were ordered to turn around. The lifeline was severed instantly, leaving the British government paralyzed by shock and facing immediate bankruptcy. John Maynard Keynes, the legendary economist, looked at the numbers and saw a financial abyss opening up. Britain was importing half its food and raw materials, paying with Lend-Lease dollars that no longer existed. Keynes calculated that Britain faced a financial Dunkirk, default starvation rations, and social collapse were imminent. There was only one option left. Britain, the former master of the world, had to beg for a lifeline. In September 1945, a dying John Maynard Keynes boarded a ship for Washington, exhausted and suffering from a heart condition. He was the greatest economic mind of the century, but he arrived not as an intellectual giant, but as a supplicant. Keynes believed he had a moral case to argue that Britain had fought alone for 2 years to save civilization. He planned to ask the U.S. for a gift of $6 billion, a retroactive payment for blood and treasure spent. He called it justice, but he soon found that justice was not a concept recognized by the American treasury. The American mood had changed. The public was tired of paying for Europe, and politicians were suspicious of Britain's new socialist government. The American negotiators, led by Fred Vinson, told him bluntly there would be no gift, only a loan with interest. Keynes was devastated, pleading that crushing Britain financially would destroy a vital ally against the rising Soviet threat. But the Americans held all the cards and offered only $3.75 billion, barely enough to survive, and with strings attached. The most poisonous condition was sterling convertibility, requiring Britain to make the pound fully convertible to dollars within 1 year. This meant anyone holding pounds could exchange them for dollars a move, designed to break the closed sterling area. The Americans framed it as free trade, but in reality it was a mechanism to smash the British trade protection loop. Keynes knew this condition was a death trap that would cause a run on the pound and drain the loan in weeks. He fought against it until his health broke, but the alternative was starvation, so Parliament reluctantly accepted the financial Munich. Keynes died months later, his heart giving out from the stress of trying to save his country from its ally. The tragedy deepened in the winter of 1947, the coldest in living memory, burying the country in snow and freezing coal. Power stations shut down, factories closed, and people shivered in candlelight, realizing the victory had brought only misery. Bread was rationed for the first time in peace, marking the beginning of the true age of austerity. Then on July 15, 1947, the clock struck on the American condition, and the pound became fully convertible. The result was exactly what Keynes had predicted, a financial massacre as the world rushed to sell pounds for dollars. Countries that had been stockpiling sterling for years unloaded it in a panic to get their hands on precious U.S. dollars. The money from the American loan, which was supposed to last for years, began to evaporate in a matter of weeks. The hemorrhage was so violent that the government watched in horror as the reserves vanished before their eyes. On August 20th, 1947, after just 5 weeks, the British government was forced to suspend convertibility and slam the window shut. They had to go to the U.S. Treasury and admit total failure, having burned through a huge portion of the loan for nothing. This financial weakness had immediate geopolitical consequences, marking the official transfer of world power from London to Washington. In February 1947, Britain sent a secret telegram to the U.S. State Department, a message of resignation and exhaustion. It stated that Britain could no longer afford to be the guardian of Greece and Turkey against Soviet expansion. The telegram essentially said, "We are broke, we are leaving. If you want to stop the communists, you must do it." This triggered the Truman Doctrine, where the United States stepped in to fill the vacuum left by the collapsing empire. The economic misery dragged on, and in 1949 the government was forced to devalue the pound from $4.86 to $2.80. Overnight, the British people became 30% poorer relative to the rest of the world, and the cost of living soared. But the final bill for the war wasn't just paid in the 1940s, it was a mortgage that spanned generations. The Anglo-American loan of 1946 was a commercial debt with interest that required annual payments for 6 decades. Through the boom of the 50s, the gloom of the 70s, the Thatcher years, and the Blair years, the checks kept coming. The final payment was made on December 29, 2006, 60 years after the guns had fallen silent. British taxpayers were still paying for the privilege of having survived World War II long into the 21st century. The story of the price of victory debunks the idea that wars have winners. In the modern era, it is a negative-sum game. Germany lost the war and was destroyed, but Britain won the war and was bankrupted. The only true winner was the United States, whose economy doubled in size and whose industry remained untouched by bombs. Through the mechanisms of Lend-Lease and the post-war loans, the United States successfully dismantled the trading preferences of the British Empire. This opened up global markets for American goods and established the dollar as the supreme currency of international trade. The United States didn't conquer the British Empire with armies, it bought it in a distressed asset sale managed by the treasury. For the British people, the legacy of 1940 remained a deep scar on the national psyche, creating a lingering sense of decline. It fueled the special relationship, which was always a polite euphemism for dependency on the stronger American power. When Winston Churchill wrote that letter to Roosevelt in December 1940, he undoubtedly saved his country from Hitler. But he also signed the deed of sale, trading the empire's independence for its immediate survival. It was a deal that had to be made as there was no other choice against the Nazi tyranny. But the cost was the future. Britain emerged from the war as a moral giant, but an economic pygmy. It had spent its inheritance to buy freedom for Europe, a noble sacrifice that bankrupted the nation. In the cold, hard light of economics, it was a liquidation, a selling off of the family estate piece by piece. The empire didn't fall in battle, it was sold to pay the bill for doing the right thing. This historical lesson reminds us that geopolitical power is inextricably linked to financial solvency. A nation that cannot pay its bills cannot maintain its influence, no matter how glorious its history. The torch was passed, not with a fanfare, but with a wire transfer and a signature on a loan agreement. Today we look back at the greatest generation with awe, but we must also recognize the price they paid in perpetuity. The world we live in now, dominated by American finance and culture, was born in those desperate negotiations of 1940. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the hidden economic history of the Second World War. I'm John, and this is the Cinematic History Tales channel, dedicated to uncovering the stories behind the headlines. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because understanding the past is the only way to prepare for the future.